My name is Robert. I go by Grant Lannon. And I was born in Syracuse, New York, and I was raised there for 5 years. Then we went to Iowa for 5 years, and then we came back to Syracuse. I finished high school in a suburb of Syracuse called DeWitt. I got involved with the U.S. Air Force because I was on a school bus and a guy in the class ahead of me was talking about flying. And I thought, well, if he can fly, I can fly. And that was a life-changing thought. And I sold my electric trains and used the money to start flying lessons when I was 15. As a result of being a pilot already, my mother was looking for a free place for a college education, so I tried out.
How did you feel about the spread of communism before the war?
At the Air Force Academy, we learned that communism was totally evil, and we had courses in that, and I felt that way too because I knew that the Soviet Union was trying to take over the world, basically. After I went through F-100 school, I thought I was going to be a fighter pilot, but 2/3 of the way through the school, they picked out about a third of us and said, you're going to be forward air controllers, and you're going to be flying light planes, and you're going to be directing airstrikes.
What year were you deployed to Vietnam?
I was assigned in the spring of 1967 and left in the spring of 1968. And a lot of things happened while I was there. First, I was assigned to what the 2nd Brigade of the 9th Infantry, which was known as the Mobile Riverine Force in the Delta. I was at a base called Dong Tam, which is just west of Mito, on the river. It was dredged out of the Mito River. The problem with that was every time it rained, it tried to go back into the river. The Mobile Riverine Force was a combined Army, Navy, and Air Force that went after the Viet Cong that were in the Delta. So we had Navy ships that took the Army troops to where they would get on their boats to make a landing. The Navy also had special boats for the enemy, including what was called the Monitor. It was actually like the Monitor in the Civil War. It had a rotating turret with a cannon on it, and it was an armored ship. So we were the forward air controllers, and we watched the operation from the air. And if they ran into trouble or they needed air power, then through our resources, we would call in the air power and direct them onto where to drop their ordnance on the enemy. By the way, we also did a lot of reconnaissance. And we lived in hooches, which are wooden slatted huts with a metal top. So we were kind of just like the Army, but we were in a more sophisticated quarters because it was permanent. They were intense a lot of the times. We were next to a field hospital, like if you've ever seen MASH, it was a MASH unit. I was there for 6 months, and then I was transferred to Quang Ngäi, Tam Khe to support the Vietnamese Army instead of U.S. forces. And I was there for 3 months, and the Tet Offensive started in January of '68, I think it was. And our bases were overrun, so we had to move to the coast to another U.S. base. So we basically abandoned our base before the NVA and the Viet Cong took it over. And at that time, I volunteered to fly and support a Khe San during the siege. So I was moved to Da Nang Air Force Base, and I flew missions out of Da Nang in support of Khe San during the siege. When I first started out, I was flying the O-1 in the Delta, and it's a single engine light airplane. We had marking rockets on it, white phosphorus rockets that we could mark the targets with once we found them. And it was very easy to see out of because it's a two-place airplane with a front and a back seat. Sometimes we could carry other spotters, like for naval artillery from boats in the Gulf. Then when I moved to Quang Ngäi, I went to the twin engine O2, which is another Cessna airplane, and it's a 4-place airplane, but in the back we had a lot of radios and everything.
What was life like when you returned home? Was the transition back to civilian life easy? Or how was it? And did you feel any adversity, or did you face any adversity coming back to the US after the war?
My transition wasn't to civilian life because I was a career officer. So when I came back, it was just getting another assignment within the military. Because since I stayed in the military community, there was no pushback against what I had done in Vietnam. So I went to Strategic Air Command and flew tankers. I did have a little trauma because I was used to directing the air battle, and in SAC, Strategic Air Command, they had a lot of rules and everything, and for somebody who was used to making his own decisions, that was a little tough on me. And they were also short of people, so we were on alert with tankers in case there was a threatened nuclear strike, so the B-52s and the bombers could go to the Soviet Union and bomb them, and we would refuel them on the way over, and we were on alert with them. And normally you pulled alert for 4 days and you got 3 days off, but sometimes if you were short of people, then it was back to back. You spent much more time on alert, and that was just all the people in one shack waiting for the klaxon to go off so you could run to your airplanes and take off. And that was a little tough on the families because you didn't have regular time off when we were short of people.
Okay, looking back on the war, was America's involvement justified? And did you agree with the war?
Yes, I agreed with the war, and I agreed with the war even after I left Vietnam. The U.S. strategy was containment, and that was to inhibit the communists from expanding their influence over other countries. And Vietnam did that. And I went back, I tried to find the year I went back, but I went back to Vietnam in 2007 on overseas adventure tours. Started in the north at their capital and went through Saigon and ended up in the Delta where I started. And I went to some of the places that were very close to the bases that I flew out of. And we interacted with the Vietnamese people. And even some of the NVA soldiers. I even ended up in this soldier's house who captured Saigon. I think it's called Ho Chi Minh City now. And we had a great time with all the people on the tour and everything. And all of us ended up singing "You Are My Sunshine" together in his house. And I learned, and all the people were friendly. Even the people that were in North Vietnam were friendly. I had a really good feeling when I came back after going back.
How do you feel about the general media's portrayal of the war, and do you agree with it?
Well, during the war, I think they were instrumental in causing the defeat because they were totally biased in their reporting, and they indicated that we were losing the war. So they were a major factor in us negotiating a settlement and saying that we were defeated. And I certainly didn't agree with that at all. Since then, there have been a few movies that are pretty good, like I told you about Bat 2-1
Yep.
and for Forward Air Controller, representation.
Have you visited the Vietnam War Memorial? If yes, what was your reaction?
Yes, I've been there more than once. I remember the controversy when they were building it, that it was below ground and it was degrading the people that went to Vietnam. But it's a unique memorial. It's well done, and yes, I know some names on the wall, so I'm fine with going there.
Are there any lasting effects from the war that you still feel today?
I feel bad about the people that lost their lives there. It was the politicians that lost the war, and I feel bad of the people that died. But I think we did do the strategy of containment as long as we could, given the bias of the politicians. So I'm proud of my service in Vietnam.
Okay, so you ready to go ahead and start?
Sure.
Okay, so the first question, because I know you sent me an email discussing Agent Orange. So our first question we wanted to ask was, what was your experience with Agent Orange? Like, how did it impact you during the war, and do you still feel any of these impacts today?
It didn't impact me. I haven't seen any symptoms of Agent Orange poisoning, but I am in the risk group category with the VA. So if any of the any diseases occur that can be attributed to Agent Orange, then the VA will provide, medical care for me.
Got it. I do also recall.
When I was escorting the missions in the '01, I was always above the spray plane. So,
Okay.
But they sprayed a lot in the Rung Sot, I think it was called, just south of Saigon, so that they could destroy the vegetation, and the ships going in and out of Saigon would be safe. I mean, they could see anybody that was going to attack them.
Okay, got it. And you did mention that you last time you went to Vietnam, you actually saw someone there that you believe may have been disfigured because of Agent Orange. Could you potentially tell me a little bit about that?
It's hard for me to remember exactly what her problem was. I remember she was begging, but I think she was disfigured, but I just don't remember the details.
Yeah, no worries at all.
I think she
Definitely
was a
questions.
child, a child of somebody that was affected by the Agent Orange.
Got it. Okay, so you also told us about the Riverine Force that you assisted. So just more specifically, what did the Mobile Riverine Force do?
Well, it was all operations in the Delta. So they used the boats and the armored boats to land the troops on land. It was amphibious operations. They landed the troops, and then they supported them from the river if they went inland. Um, and all of the boats were, you sent a picture of Dong Tam. All of the boats were in uh, the bay there that was dredged out of the river. So it was a joint Air Force, Army, Navy exercise. We even pulled duty on the command post on, it was called a motorized barge, but it was like an LST. So we coordinated airstrikes through the command post on the ship wherever they were, and we pulled duty on that. So it's actually the first time I ever pulled duty on a Navy ship.
What is an LST?
A landing ship, it's like in World War II, they had a very large front that came down, and they could offload equipment from the ship.
Ah, got it. Okay. Did you conduct surveillance of people that lived in boats within the Mekong Delta?
Yeah, we were always doing reconnaissance missions, and if we saw anything suspicious, then we could report back, when the mission was over, or if we were threatened, we could call in an airstrike and put an airstrike in on them. Occasionally, we would fire rockets at them. We only had marking rockets unless we could get high explosive rockets from the Army. Um, but it was all aimed at deterring them. And there were a lot of zones that there weren't supposed to be any people in. So if you saw activity in those zones, then you could report that or put an airstrike in on it if it was significant.
Got it. And the high explosive rounds, because I recall you telling me about that during the previous interview. Those highly explosive rounds, was that like something that y'all were allowed to do, like put high explosive rounds on your plane, and if you saw someone that just didn't seem like they belonged, you were allowed to use lethal force?
Uh, we were allowed to use lethal force, but we weren't in general carrying high explosive rockets. We carried marking rockets because we could call in an airstrike. So
Got it.
it wasn't like we were out there trying to start a battle all on our own. We were just a support.
Okay, got it. So whenever you were actually doing reconnaissance, I do know you just told me that, if people were out of their designated zone, that would be one thing that could deem them as suspicious. But was there anything else that you were looking for that would potentially make people look suspicious or something like that?
Well, if we saw a concentration of people that looked like they were in military uniforms, that would be suspicious. And normally we had access to where the friendlies were and everything. So, and any unusual river traffic or uh, anything that looked like it could be a military operation, then we could either take action or report it back.
Got it. Okay. And then you also mentioned during the previous interview those hooches that you lived in. Would you mind just going a little bit into like what those hooches were?
Oh, they were just, and I think you put a picture of
Yeah,
one
we
in the
did. Yeah.
video. Well, they were generally at one end they had a closed room for meetings and like an officers club for relaxing and with drinks afterward. But the rest of it was open, and everybody had a bunk and lockers next to their bunk. So you didn't have a private room in those.
Mm.
And they were wooden on the side, and normally um, they either had tents on the top or metal roofing on the top. And so it was pretty basic living. The room at the end had an air conditioner in it most times. So if you were overheated, you could go in there. But we slept with the temperatures that existed on the outside. And
Wow.
in other locations, we had rooms and buildings, but in the Delta at Dong Tam, it was everybody pretty much lived in hooches. And they
Okay.
actually had uh, inflatable Quonset huts that they used for the hospital. And it turned out that wasn't such a good idea because when you had mortar rounds coming in, the shrapnel would put holes in the inflatable Quonset hut and it would collapse. So they put sandbags up pretty high around it. So shrapnel from the mortar rounds hitting the base would be less likely to hit the inflatable hooches, but they were not a success when, put them in a combat zone.
Got it. Whenever you were actually in Vietnam, did you ever encounter any enemies, or what you would classify as enemies face to face?
Uh, No, not face to face. I was out on one mission, and this was at Quang Ngäi. It was near the coast, and I was a little bored, and I saw some fishermen on the dikes. So I made a rocket run on them, never intending to fire anything, and several trees started moving. And it turns out it was a Viet Cong squad that was down there in camouflage. And I managed to spot where they were hiding and everything. And I did put a helicopter strike in on them. And then the South Vietnamese were having lunch not far from where I was. And after all the action started, they came down and swept the zone and found the VC that were killed and everything.
Oh wow. Were you ever actually like shot at, or did you ever have any like mortar rounds drop nearby you while you were in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, in Dong Tam, we got mortared quite a bit, and we had uh, a trench that we could go to for cover, uh, and we also had artillery right next to the hooch, and they could reply if they could detect where the mortar rounds were coming from. Um, and that happened fairly often, but a lot of times the artillery officers, we had 105 howitzers right on the base. They would fire at random spots where they thought there might be enemy trying to get close enough to mortar us. And that was pretty successful because they were afraid to move at night because they never knew if an artillery shell was going to hit them when they were traveling. And then that artillery officer was transferred, and the new one decided he wasn't going to waste the ammunition on shooting at night. And we started getting mortared pretty regularly there for a while.
Oh
And then when
wow.
I was at Dong Tam, the uh, the NVA had a major rocket attack on our fuel depot, and it erupted in flame and explosions and everything. And I was there for that.
Weren't you also at a what was it? Battle of Khe San?
Khe San.
Oh, Khe San.
Yeah.
Um, what was that like? Because I heard that that was a pretty large battle.
Yeah, well, the Marines and their support people were trapped in Khe San, and there were outlying hills that the U.S. had occupied, and some of those had artillery on them to protect Khe San, but they were attacked all the time, and the NVA and the VC would dig trenches to get to the perimeter of the base. And if we could see them working to do that, we would put airstrikes in on them and stop them from trying to get close to the base. And
Wow.
one time at Khe San, um, I can't remember if I told you this, but I was flying just to the west of the base, and some 37 millimeter anti-aircraft came up on both sides of the airplane, and this was in the daytime. Of course, they were tracer rounds, and they exploded above me. And luckily, they didn't hit the airplane. And I turned around and I could see where the gun sight was. So I called in some. Well, first I called in some 105s that were returning from up north, and they said I was crazy for attacking a gun site. They weren't interested. But the F-100s that were stationed in country, they were interested in doing that. And they bombed the site. And I thought the bombs were right on target. And I gave them a kill for the site. But then after they left, the site came back up. But I guarantee you, nobody in that site had eardrums anymore.
Ooh. Wow. That must have been pretty scary.
And also, in one of the initial attacks, if you look up the attack on Lang Vei, when the NVA came down with tanks, uh, that was an outpost, and I think it's VEI, Langvei.
Yeah, I got it. Battle of Lang Bay, February 1968.
Right. And the tanks overran the base, and the people that were on the base went into their bunkers, which were underground, and managed to avoid being killed. Not all of them, a lot of them were killed. But the the Marines organized a rescue mission, and they went in and cleared a channel to get them out, and they did get a lot of them out, even though they were totally surrounded. And that started at night, and I could see the NVA artillery across the river in Laos on the side of a ridge, and I tried to get a airstrike to put in on them, but I couldn't get air at that time. So they were attacking with artillery also, but I was there when the tanks overran the outpost.
Wow. And of all of your I guess of all the battles or all the places that you were located, which one of those battles do you feel like, I guess you could say, impacted you or the most, or was the most notable to you?
Well, I volunteered for Khe San, and it was certainly a major battle. So I felt I had an effect there. It was rewarding.
Got it. And do you actually because this is something that a lot of people ask the field out if they're interviewing, do you actually know anyone, was there anyone within your group or any friends that you had in Vietnam that were actually killed?
No, there was nobody none of my friends were killed. I mean, there were friends that were killed elsewhere, but I was not stationed with anybody that was killed. And when I first went to Da Nang, not everybody had air conditioned quarters. I don't know what's happening here. So I managed to get permission from from somebody to occupy the room of a fighter pilot that was missing in action, and all his stuff was still there. So I stayed in his room for quite a while. I don't know if they ever found him.
Wow. So the next thing I'm going to ask you about is the Tet Offensive, because I do recall you mentioned that you kind of had to evacuate from certain bases whenever the Tet Offensive occurred, and I do also know it happened 9 days after the start of the Battle of Khe San. So that would probably explain you were probably around there whenever it ended up happening. But just during the Tet Offensive, what was your experience of having all the bases around you overrun? And how overall, how were the troops affected by that? Because the Tet Offensive was obviously a massive turning point in the war. So how was U.S. morale affected, or just overall, how did people feel whenever that did occur?
Well, I think the morale was good. As far as we were concerned, we just loaded up our airplanes with our ground personnel and equipment and moved to a base on the coast. So we were out of there before the enemy overran the base where we were. But I understand they did shoot the maids that we had in the leg, just to teach them a lesson for supporting U.S. troops. So I never came close to being on the front lines as a result of that. There were people up north that were totally surrounded. I can't remember the base where they were just fighting for existence. It included forward air controllers too. It was up north. But of course, the Battle of Khe San intensified with Tet. So that's why I volunteered to go up there just to help out. And I landed once there, but it got so bad that it was too dangerous to land there. And we supported it out of Da Nang. We flew up there from Da Nang. and we never landed there again.
Got it. And at Khe San, because there was this general media portrayal that Khe San was kind of like, they were calling it like the Alamo of Vietnam or something like that, where they, the media portrayal at the time was that all the troops were surrounded, and this was going to be the next Dien Bien Phu, that one French battle before the Americans got involved. Did you ever feel like that was accurate, or did you feel like the Marines always had a relatively good hold on what was going on, and the Vietnamese just kind of spun it out of control?
No, it was always a risk that they would be overrun, but they certainly had a lot of air power, and they had good artillery support, even from the surrounding hills. Where, these outposts, these artillery outposts, these guys were just a very small area with artillery, and they managed to not be overrun. But we put a massive amount of bombs. Even the B-52 strikes went in there and killed a
Yeah,
lot of people. So
I heard that the B-52s were definitely a very large impact. Did you feel like the base was actually anywhere close to being overrun?
well, I wasn't close enough to, if I'd been on the ground, I might have felt that way. But I didn't get any intelligence that indicated it was going to be.
Okay. Now, I also know, is there anything else? Well, I guess before I get to this question, is there anything else that you feel like would be notable to mention about your time in Vietnam, of any of the places that you were stationed in Vietnam? Like any major battles that you're a part of that you feel like maybe important? Um, any other massive, like anything that you would, view as like a pretty large experience that affected you?
No, I think Khe San was the biggest battle I was involved in. The rest of them were small military operations. Uh, the Mobile Riverine Force uh, uh, events, the amphibious warfare, was very interesting. They did a good job. I mean, they put the troops in and took objectives and then put them back on the ships. And there was one battle where we went up right in the middle of the night. We were called up, and um, we had fighters, but it was very hard to see where the target was. So we were talking to the people on the ground, and there were fires that had already been started in the battle. And we used the fires as landmarks to put the fighter uh, fighter bombers on the target. And of course, the enemy had no idea that we could hit them because it was so dark. And one of the leaders of that came to our base at Dongtam and described what they found the next morning when they went through the area that the VC were in. They found bodies and rifles and armaments in the trees where they'd been blown apart and up into the vegetation. So we did a pretty good job there with not being able to see the target.
Wow. Wow. Um,
Well, the North Vietnamese were ready to surrender after the B-52 strikes.
in Khe San?
Not being able to overrun Khe San. No, the B-52s were bombing up north too. So their morale was pretty bad, and the word was that they were, after the war, that they were ready to surrender. But Nixon, for whatever information he was getting, decided to call a truce and negotiate a settlement. But they were ready to surrender. And there's a good book called Vietnam, This Time We Win. I don't know if I mentioned that before.
No, I don't think you mentioned it before.
It's got a lot of information as to what the actual situation was when we negotiated a peace settlement. Of course, there was a lot of pressure from home too, from the media and the anti-war people and everything. So we didn't see any of that. But I thought the military aspect of the fact that the North Vietnamese were ready to surrender and lose the war, I thought was very interesting.
I do also recall that, like, after the U.S. actually withdrew from South Vietnam, that it took, only a matter of like a couple weeks for North Vietnam to end up actually overrunning the South. So did you ever feel like maybe the U.S. was like what was overall holding together South Vietnam, or do you think that they actually had, like, what do you think went wrong to, where the North Vietnamese were able to take over the South so quickly after the U.S. ended up leaving?
Well, one of the major factors was the Democrats refused to provide the South Vietnamese with armaments after we left. That was a major factor. Um, so I'm sure it encouraged the North Vietnamese that they would be unobstructed, and that's why they did it. But from what I read, the South Vietnamese were short of armaments and ammunition and the things that we had supplied them for years.
Got it. Okay, so after the war, you ended up mentioning that you actually returned to Vietnam. So just out of curiosity, why did you feel compelled to go back to Vietnam? Like, was there a specific reason? Like, why did you end up going back?
Oh, just to see what it was like now under communist rule. And
And
the tour was very, very good.
how did you how did you feel that the communists actually did in regards to, take to Vietnam after you went back and visited? Did you feel like Vietnam was doing well overall, or did you feel like if there was a different government in place that it probably would have been better? Like, how did you feel visiting, about how the communists did?
Well, um, there was some, it looked like the country was in pretty good shape. Um, of course, after the Russians left, uh, and they were supporting the North Vietnamese,
Yeah.
um, and I guess the rule was pretty strict during that period. But after they withdrew, then the regime, the Vietnam regime lightened up, and it felt like the people were, the biggest feeling I had was that they appreciated Americans in the way they tried to conduct the war, especially the South Vietnamese. But even the ex-North Vietnamese soldiers, I think, realized that there were a lot of good things that the Americans had tried to do while they were there. And I didn't find them unfriendly at all. I told you I went to a house of an NVA soldier that took over the presidential palace. Even he was friendly. But since I've heard, because um, of friends of Judy's, who she has a massage therapist that's from Vietnam, that the Chinese are really dominating Vietnam now, and they are resentful of that. And if they had to choose sides, I know they'd pick the U.S.
I would have to agree with you. I've actually done my own research on that subject, and yeah. So you did also mention that you ended up in a soldier's house that captured Saigon. Was that the guy you just mentioned at the presidential palace?
Right. Yes. And he was
Got
very
it.
friendly. He was very friendly. Actually, even the people up north were friendly. Uh, like I said, I think after living under heavy communist rule, they realized, even those that weren't directly involved with the Americans, that the Americans were trying to do the right thing and they wanted to live in a freer society.
Yep, sorry about that. Yeah, no, that I do recall you mentioning that in the past. And then just last question. You mentioned you had a good feeling, like overall after the war, you had a good feeling about it. Like, why was that? Like, what did you feel specifically?
Well, we supported the strategy of containment, um, and kept the communists from expanding, which is not the case nowadays. Um, and so that was the overall strategy. And I felt that we had done a good job at trying to keep South Vietnam free. And that was rewarding.
Understood.
Well, I know a lot of veterans were traumatized by their experience in Vietnam.
I was actually just about to
I'm,
ask you about
I'm
that.
sorry about that, but I didn't see that after I came back because, like I said, I was still in the military, so I was in a familiar surrounding and wasn't trying to adjust to civilian, quote, normal civilian life. So it wasn't very traumatic for me to come back and just resume my career.
Got it. All right.